Wet and wet painting is perhaps one of the most beautiful techniques in transparent watercolor. You can create vibrant and subtle blendings of color and interesting edge effects as pigments drying at different rates run into each other. It can seem highly unpredictable at first, but after some time you'll gain greater control over the amount of pigment and water and the drying time. In this piece, an eyedropper was used to drop clear water into a damp surface, which displaced the paint. And here, salt was dropped onto the surface, which creates interesting crystallized effects. While the wet and wet technique lends itself to abstraction, once you gain greater control over the amount of water in both paint and pigment, you can create some luscious effects in representational painting. You'll have a chance to make a few practice paintings. You can use one or both sides of two pieces of paper. I will demonstrate two different approaches, mixed and layered. Following your practice paintings, you will make a final wet and wet painting using the technique in a more intentional manner. This can be abstract, representational, or a combination of both. Before starting, you need to stretch your paper. Tape it down firmly to the board and get the entire surface wet with your large brush. Let it completely dry before you start painting. This will help reduce some of the buckling that will occur when working with the wet and wet technique. Many artists do this before starting any painting, even if it's not the wet and wet technique. I will demonstrate two approaches to the wet and wet technique. The first is the mixed approach. Once your paper has dried after stretching it, wet the surface again with a large brush or a spray bottle. You can begin dropping paint onto the surface, pre-mixed paint or from your palette. It might feel unpredictable, like a bit of a free-for-all, but that's the point with this process, experimentation. There's a lot you can do with this. Once you have some paint on the surface, you can tip the board. You'll create some veils of color flowing into each other. You can continue to add more color, and if the paper starts to dry, you can always wet it again with a spritzer bottle. As the paint starts to dry, you can get some interesting crystallized effects by dropping salt into the pools of pigment. As the paint starts to set up and dry a bit more, keep adding paint. That's when you get very interesting edge effects as paint starts to dry at different rates. It's important when experimenting with this process to not try to consciously make an image or a picture. Just put paint down and see what happens. No pun intended, but with this process you have to go with the flow. After this, I'll let the painting dry and see what I have. I may then go in with another layer. After waiting several hours for it to totally dry, I'm astonished at the beauty of this painting. It's helpful to photograph it when it's still wet, so you can see what's happened once it's dried. Some things have remained while others have disappeared or softened. Let's take a closer look at the upper left corner. Here we have some gorgeous edge effects where one color bumped up against another. It creates such a fine line that changes color. It's really just an alchemy of pigment and water. While I might be tempted to add more to the lower left where there's empty white paper, I don't want to risk disturbing that beautiful line created by the mixture of green and orange paint. On the lower right, you can see a little bit of the effects of salt. Sometimes it creates a soft white spot where it pushes water and pigment away, but at other times it can create dark spots, as you see in the lower right-hand corner. Sometimes the salt technique is best practiced on its own. With other paintings, I've sometimes wet the surface and added more, but with this, I don't think it's necessary. In some sense, with this process, the painting really paints itself. For the layered wet and wet technique, I'll put each layer of color on individually and let it dry between. It'll give me a little bit more control over the placement of colors. You can work with the pool of color on your palette, but you can also pre-mix the colors, especially if you're covering a larger area. The paper stayed wet long enough for me to put the blue and the green in together. Then I let it dry completely and wet the surface again to put in the orange. It does take a while to be able to predict the drying time to get all your colors in before the paper dries. In this image, I don't want to spritz the paper because I want the colors to stay in the place where I put them, even though of course they may float around a bit. Here I had enough time to also get an edge of yellow around the orange, giving it a nice glow. Again, I've let the paper dry completely and I'm wetting the surface again, and now I'm going in with a big bold purple around the edges. Because it's a lot of space to cover, I've pre-mixed this color. I've had enough time to be able to also get a little bit of blue on the edge of that, but you can see that the buckling of the paper has shifted the color a bit. I don't mind because I accept this as a natural part of the wet and wet painting process. It's really quite lovely. It almost looks like a tornado or a storm system. I was a little rushed trying to put the blue in at the end, so I'm going to put it in again as a rich blue-green. Of course, I let the paper dry completely and then wet the surface again before doing that. I also want to intensify what has become a painting of a stormy vortex. After the blue-green layer was dry, I ended up adding a little bit more purple at the corners to increase the sense of space and depth. It's great to see these side by side, the accidental and the more intentional. I always appreciate the combination of intention and accident that's the hallmark of wet and wet painting. After you've experimented with the mixed and layered approaches, it's time to make a painting using what you've learned. You can see samples of student work in the sample painting folder for this module.